Oh my.
Hello, everyone. Just wait for everyone to hop in real quick.
I know everyone on the call so far. This is lovely.
Give it a few. All right. We got some hellos out here. Hello, hello. All right. Oh, you guys can still see that. Okay. Oops, moving too fast. I gotta figure out how to move this out the way. Okay, well, that won't be too long. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Michigan ASLA's Diverse Perspective webinar series. I am Stephanie Owino, and I am the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Michigan chapter. Just gonna go briefly over. So the Diverse Perspective webinar series was created as a way to highlight minority design students, professionals, while providing a platform for them to share their experiences, work, and contributions within the professional field of landscape architecture. Our webinars are held bi-monthly, so it's held this month, and our next one will be in October, I believe. September, July, August, September, actually. And today we're joined here with Kene Okigbo, who is an emerging professional at RDG Planning and Design, Landscape Architecture Studio. He graduated from North Dakota State University, earning his Bachelor of Landscape Architecture and Bachelor of Science in Environmental Design. Kene serves on numerous industry panels, including ASLA's Government Affairs, Climate Action, and LAM editorial advisory committees. He considers design of the public realm an awesome responsibility and values the lessons shared by his industry's peers. Kene imagines new mediums through which innovative voices in landscape architecture can be amplified and is fascinated by emerging project typologies that can offer solutions to pervasive societal issues. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kene.
Thank you for that. I am about to share my screen. Bear with me one moment, and please let me know if and when you're able to see it.
And while he's finding that, just a note, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A session, or you can submit it in the chat. This webinar is being recorded. So if you missed any part or have to leave, you can find this information on our website at michiganasla.org. Thanks.
Good deal. Well, good evening, guys, gals, and otherwise. I am really excited to have this conversation. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, something that has interested me for, I think, years now, and I always love talking about it. So with no more further ado, let's dive into it. To give a bit of context about Afrofuturism and about me specifically, I was born about here, and then we moved here, and then moved back here in college or so, and then back for college, and then down here for an internship, and then back up for college, and then back here for or rather here for another internship. All of that to say that, like, Afrofuturism, when we dive into the definition, really has to do with the diaspora, or people that have left a place and made a new place home, but they still have strong ties to that first home. And that is me. So when I think about this, I think of how to design for others like me. Afrofuturism deals specifically with the African diaspora, but it designing for a holistic view of people is what I'm excited to talk with you about. So looking at the etymology of Afrofuturism to start, etymology just being the history of the word, the first time that the term was used was in 1993, and this graph just shows its use over time. Thank you, Google, for having all of the information across time. But in 2018, I'm sure that you see a bit of a jump. That's when the movie Black Panther came out. And even though Black Panther is a great example of Afrofuturism, without a more illustrative and a broader definition, I think we can get lost when we only use one thing as an example. So one of the bits that I'm excited to do is to share different perspectives on what a definition for Afrofuturism is, and then from there extrapolate and see how there's a connection with landscape architecture. So as I mentioned, Black Panther came out in 2018, but bear in mind that there have been examples of Afrofuturism in written works, spanning back, the earliest that I'm showing here is about the early 2000s, mid 90s, but it goes back even further than that. And then beyond written works from speculative fiction, there's Sun Ra, who was an experimental jazz musician who had his works, whose work spans back to about 1972. Missy Elliott, who I think many of us are familiar with her work in Supa Dupa Fly, which came out in 1997, and then Outkast with their music video and song Prototype, which came out in 2004. All of these I would define as Afrofuturist, and others have as well. But back to a definition, and the first time that Afrofuturism was talked about, at least from what I can find and from what anybody can find, the first time that the phrase was used was in 1993 when Mark Derry coined it in his writings, Black to the Future. And he asked the question, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of history, imagine possible futures for themselves? And the short answer is yes. And the answer to that question is also Afrofuturism. If I didn't need to define what Afrofuturism is and raise that bar graph or that line chart by talking about this as much as possible, then we'd end the presentation right here. But we need a definition. So what is Afrofuturism? Some would define it as speculative fiction that treats African-American themes and addresses African-American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture and more generally, African-American significance and appropriate images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. That was hard for me to read, let alone say, let alone for anybody to pick up quickly. So I think that we need to come up with our own definition. We can scrap this, we can do better. First things first, I will jump back to about 2017-ish when This American Life made a specific episode which talked about envisioning a future specifically for the African diaspora. They looked at Afrofuturism before Black Panther came out, and they asked the same questions that we're going to be asking today. And in that, they started to make this definition, which was...
It's like this way of talking about Black people in a way that's really hopeful. It's just the idea that we would be engaged in the same kinds of things that, science fiction writers have always talked about, that we would be engaged with technology, that we would have a future in space, that we would, master time travel, that we would have a future in utopian or dystopian landscapes. It's like...
Sabari, this is about science fiction. That's really just the tip of the iceberg. And the science fiction part is meaningful because while there have been Black characters in sci-fi for a while now, they're almost never the protagonists. They're never the ones driving the action. And for so long, in so many imaginings of the future, in so much science fiction, there were no Black people at all, which, as Neil points out, makes no sense. He says you can tell Black people are going to make it into the future because they've survived so much already over the centuries.
One of the things that's sort of really specific about Afrofuturism that I like is that it takes into account the past in a lot of ways. It imagines that, Black people had forms of survival through, the slave trade, through persecution, that's almost a technology in itself, the ways in which we've come through those things.
Oh, I see. The survival skills.
Yeah, and that everything that's been a part of our culture has made it possible for us to pave the way for the future. That's the thing that I like about it, I think. The feeling like despite whatever trials or travails you've come through, that you will exist in the future. That just kind of makes me kind of like love being Black. It makes me feel like what I love about being Black. Like, oh yeah, we can get through this.
And what Neil Drumming was saying there is the reason why I also identify so strongly with Afrofuturism. It's the reason why I love the concept and why the typology seems as though it is about to see a boom, because it is hopeful. It's respective of a past, but it takes that, embraces it, tweaks the bits that need to be, and then it envisions an idyllic future. And we'll see that time and time again in the different examples that we walk through and we examine together. But it's really interesting. So that was Neil Drumming and Ira Glass giving their definition of what Afrofuturism is. And if we are to look broadly at what artists are saying, at what different intellectuals are saying, then Tim Fielder and Princess Weeks would both define themselves as Afrofuturists. And in separate microcosms, they've given their own definition of what Afrofuturism is, as Neil just gave to us. And across all of these broad definitions, there are a few themes that we start to see. So in Tim Fielder's definition, he says that Afrofuturism is a mode of operation in which you take any kind of action, whether that be storytelling, art making, clothing, architecture, I would interject landscape architecture, and you infuse it with Afrocentricity. By doing so, you do it in a way where you're hearkening back to things in the past. You're still living in the present, but you're looking and pointing toward the future. Princess Weeks goes on to give her definition, which is Afrofuturism is the addressing the cultural issues and concerns of the African diaspora through technoculture and science fiction. Afrofuturism is about creating art out of pain, strength, loss, and successes. It is fundamentally rooted in being denied a full history and looking to the future to correct that. So at this point, I would usually give an explanation of what the diaspora is, highlighting that I was born in Nigeria, lived in Kenya for a bit, and then moved to the United States. I have cousins and uncles and aunts that started in Nigeria and now are in Asia, in Europe, in South America, and North America. We are all members of the diaspora. We left our home, but still have very strong ties back to our home. And from there, and with the three definitions we've just looked at, we can create our own, which is that Afrofuturism is the genre in which the African diaspora is able to harken back to its past to envision an idyllic future, which is intrinsically rooted in the diaspora's own culture. With that established, I would argue the point that Afrofuturism is justice in the built environment. All right, bear with me. If we think a little bit differently about the progression of civil rights to equal rights to, I'd say that we're in an age right now of equitable rights and so on, and we think of it as we would think about dimensions and as we think about physics, then one-dimensional experience in a ray, if you will, is civility. If we expound on that and we expand that one dimension in a perpendicular fashion where we basically grow on civility, you need civility to have a base, then equal rights are where we land. When you expand on equality and equal rights, that's when we start talking about equitable rights, equitable thinking, equitable practice, equitable experiences, and equitable spaces. And if you think of three-dimensional space, which we all live in, and you move all three of those dimensions forward, creating a fourth dimension, some, specifically Einstein, would say that that fourth dimension is time. And I would say that when you take equity, but you are fully respective of what came before and what will come next. So when you factor in time to equity, that's when you have justice. When we look at the problems of the past and we try to rectify them today so that we don't have them tomorrow, that is justice. We've all seen variations of this graphic where with civility and equality, everybody is given the same means, the same materials. In equitable practice, we are given what we need to get past a barrier. And through justice, we observe and recognize that there is a barrier, and therefore we remove that. The following question that sometimes arises is like, why does it matter? Why even talk about this? What's the point of talking about weird words like Afrofuturism or trying to equate justice as a fourth dimension? And what does that have to do with landscape architecture? And the answer is pretty simple when you think about it, and it's that representation matters. Like, we need spaces that are designed specifically for the African diaspora, because I, living in Omaha, Nebraska, and when I lived in Fargo, North Dakota, or wherever I live, need a space that responds to what I need as a human being, as a person. I need representation in film so that I can identify with characters. I need representation in profession so that I see that there's a path for me. I can imagine myself in a position of a principal or beyond because I've seen that. And I need representation in my physical space because so many times spaces are not designed to be hospitable for people like me. And therefore, I specifically have to think about spaces that would not only be hospitable, but would be welcoming to people like me. So really, the reason why I'm so interested in Afrofuturism is it's very selfish. It's incredibly selfish, but I'm okay with that. I see Afrofuturism as an opportunity to create places that speak to a person's culture. And that is, like, culture isn't just what we live today, it's ethos, it's who we are, and it's made up and predicated on who we were yesterday and who our parents were yesterday and who our parents' parents were. And all of that is passed on and compounded and pressed into the diamonds that we all are. But instead of just talking about floaty ideas, I am grateful that I have the opportunity to talk about projects and built work which I would define as Afrofuturist. The first of these is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. Mass Design Group, working with the Equal Justice Initiative, designed and constructed this. It sits on a 6-acre site in Montgomery. In the big point behind this project is to commemorate the lives which were stolen during lynchings in America's history. Between 1882 and 1968, so that's less than 100 years, 4,743 people were lynched in the United States. 3,446 of them were Black people. That stat is from the NAACP. And this memorial is the first of its kind, and it was erected in 2018. I mean, yes, we could be critical and say, wow, from 1882 to 2018, that's like, we're a little bit late on this, aren't we? But at the same time, the fact that we are creating a space that is able to memorialize, look to our past, place something in our present, our future, which can help the country and its populace to, at least when you're recognizing the full past and not washing over this real, tangible, statistically like quantifiable part of history, At that point, when we recognize that, we're able to look to our future and envision ourselves in it because we saw all of our ancestors. These obelisks that are hanging from the ceiling act like giant tombstones. Like, they have the counties which each of these murders took place in. The artwork in the monuments doesn't pull any of its punches, nor should it. I'd already talked about how this highlights the three temporal modes that are seen in all examples of Afrofuturism. It's looking to the past, it's placed very strongly in the present, but it allows for those that didn't necessarily live through the 1800s, but are still living through the 1800s, if you understand what I'm saying, to at least see themselves in the future, see a path forward, because we're able to recognize, if not reconcile, the past. The next project that I'm talking about is technically outside of the United States. So people will say, well, Kene, it's not Afrofuturism. It's can't be the diaspora because they didn't leave, right? It's like, okay, you got me. You're right. By the definition that we made, you are right. It's not Afrofuturism, but I think that it does hint at what we can aspire to do. So Al-Azhar Park in Cairo, Egypt. This was designed by Sasaki. The site was an urban reconstruction, and the quote that was used to describe the site was that it was a, quote, dumping ground for rubble from earthquakes, wars, and fires, unquote. And now it is a 30-hectare site. Mind you, it's in Cairo. That's about 74 acres. And it pulls about 2 million guests annually, which for a war-torn, beaten down space is huge. The things that I find most interesting about this are that it looks specifically to historic Islamic gardens for its design influence. And that's not just seen in grand forms, it's seen in the smallest details of lighting design, of the pillars, the columns, of the flat work throughout. And that is that connection to the past. The historic Islamic design pulled from the past, seen in a contemporary setting, which allows the next generation of landscape architects to walk through this and think of oh yeah, I want to build the next XYZ. It allows people to envision a future which is more emblematic of their true selves. So with both of these examples, we touched on this with each of them, but it has to be I can't overstate this. They are both definitively Afrofuturist because they look to the past of the diaspora. They place both of those in a contemporary setting, but then they allow the people that are moving through the space, the people that the space was specifically designed for, to envision themselves in an idyllic future. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and transition and talk about some work that I am really glad that I get to be a part of. And if you would have asked me 6 months ago, I would not have defined this as Afrofuturist, but after a few public meetings and listening sessions, not through any of my influence, but I think it can be possibly defined as Afrofuturism, which has been a goal of mine. I've wanted to work on an Afrofuturist project for a minute, and I look forward to working on a lot more of them. But the Beltline Trail in Omaha, Nebraska, it's a proposed trail. One of the planners in our office has done a lot of work in Omaha and has been thinking through how all of the systems connect. And just to give you a bit of background into Omaha, Omaha's incredibly segregated. I was surprised when I moved here, and I was warned before I moved to Omaha, like, oh, by the way, like we're pretty split. And then I was in South Omaha, moving eastward. You cross a street, and then the restaurants are in Spanish, and all of the aesthetic shifts pretty quickly. There's a stark break. And same thing happens when you're heading northward, because North Omaha is the highest populace of African American and Black identifying people in the Omaha area. South Omaha is incredibly Hispanic, the Latino, Latinx community. And then West Omaha is far more Caucasian. And specifically looking at trail work, mind you, the Beltline does not exist right now. So the trail investment in Omaha thus far has not been concentrated in North Omaha. And the reason why active transportation projects and trail projects are interesting and are turning into a passion of mine, because as you dive deeper and deeper into that world, you find that like there are startling stats that accompany it. I was on Twitter, as I sometimes am, and a friend in town tweeted like, oh, just like fun fact for everybody, if your area code, or rather if your zip code has you in North Omaha as opposed to West Omaha, your life expectancy has a about 10-year delta. And because it's Twitter, somebody chimed in and said, well, cite your sources. Well, census, like that's census data. We all have that. That's and the reason why I bring up that anecdote along with the fact that I'm talking about the Beltline is because active transportation projects, when we're thinking about walkability, walkers, people that define as walkers, have a 21 odd percent lower mortality. Isn't that wild? Like broad mortality, not just looking at like heart attack or respiratory failure. That's broad stat. And bikers are up in the 40s, which is astounding. So when I think of bike infrastructure in North Omaha, I think that I need to like redefine how I explain to my parents what I do for a living, because I'm not only increasing quality of life if projects like this are successful, I'm literally increasing quantity of life, which is massive. Like that is one of the most inspirational things that like wakes you up in the morning, keeps you up late at night. But the strength of the Beltline Trail, as I'm getting off topic a little bit, is that it would be a connection to a lot of the other trail infrastructure that we have in the Omaha Metro, crossing over the river to Council Bluffs. So if you lived in this area, then you could couple with our transit lines, access is expanded. Your ability to move around without needing to depend on a vehicle grows by, I'm not sure how many times fold. So we're working on this project with EGA, partner in town, and we are connecting the North Omaha Transit Center down to the trailhead, which is at the Hamilton and Military intersection. What's been fun about this is that through our fieldwork and assessment, we've been able to like walk through some of these urban jungles and just have a better understanding of what makes North Omaha what it is. So the reason I threw all of these photos on a slide together is because all of these are representative of North Omaha. Like we have the strong historic ties, and if you are in or passing through Omaha right now, I'll remind you that we're going through Native Omaha Days, where there will be a parade. Tonight is the Glow Ride, where we'll get glow sticks, we'll get on bikes, and we will fight the stereotype that Black people do not bike, because we do. But at the north or the top right image is a photo of Joanna LaFleur extending her hand with a photo of Rowena Moore, who is the founder of the Malcolm X Foundation. For those that are unfamiliar, Malcolm X is from Omaha. He was born in Omaha. I didn't know that until I moved here. We have older, more classic developments with like a modern twist. I love that we painted this for the campaign and election, and we decided we wanted it, we liked it, we're going to keep it that way. And then we have newer developments as well. So like North Omaha is old, it is young, it is vibrant, it is tired, and it is energetic all at the same time. And that's part of what makes this project really interesting. So in going through this project, we had an internal charrette, and we've had a few public meetings where we've asked, like, all right, here's the alignment that we see. Number one, do you see any problems with that? Number two, what do you want? Like, yes, a trail is a patch of concrete that follows a path, but at the same time, a trail is access, a trail is health. There are so many adjacent schools to the trail itself. There are connections to universities to the north and south. There are connections to a high school close by. So like there's Kennedy Early Childhood Center. So from kindergarten, if not preschool, all the way through to graduate education, we are connecting onto this specific trail. Along with that, there's also so much access to clean, accessible, equitable food. Like there are so many urban farms that are adjacent to this. So when asking people, here's what it seems like we're seeing, but what do you see? What do you want? This is what we heard from people. People wanted to see inspirational quotes. People wanted to see dog stations and recycling bins. Little free libraries was an interesting one. And then they wanted to see transit connections. So they wanted to be able to get onto the bus line and the BRT. But time and time again, people wanted to see history. People didn't want to forget who came before them. They wanted the next generation to have an understanding of who laid the groundwork for what North Omaha is. They also wanted to make sure that there was space specifically for the elders of the community. They wanted to make sure that true North Omaha culture was reflected, and art came through in every stakeholder meeting, every public meeting, the open house that we had last night. At every point, art and culture came through, and they wanted to make sure that the artists that were being tasked with representing an authentic North Omaha were from North Omaha. Everything in red on the screen are both names and events which people wanted to make sure were reflected. So Rowena Moore, as I had mentioned before, was the founder of the Malcolm X Foundation. Dr. Eugene Skinner, strong ties to local schools actually named after him. Malcolm X, we are all familiar with Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, and his ties to Omaha. Kathy Hughes, owner and founder of Radio One, one of the in terms of Black excellence, like a pivotal example from Omaha, went to Creighton and UNO, so some of the local universities. Bob Boozer, a sports icon. So all of these names that are from this community, but don't get the recognition that they deserve. All of these like nationally worthy names, and just making sure that there's space for them in their own backyard. So that the project's not done. Like we're still in like phase one of a 4 or 5 phase process. But the reason I wanted to talk about it is just because like it is Afrofuturism. I was so specific not to use the terminology, not to try and embed anything. But as soon as people said, we want to make sure that we are creating a space which recognizes what people did before us, it's like, oh, all right, you're hinting at something that I know a little bit about, but okay, all right, I'll be quiet. It's like, oh, by the same token, we want to make sure that the space is made for our kids, and that like as they are growing up there, they're looking back to the past, is like, all right, you done it. You said the magic words. This is exactly the typology that I think more and more projects will be diving into. And there, as we talked about, there's already a lot of projects that do this. I I can't overstate my excitement about the typology, about the type of work that I think will come. And I will gladly go into more detail about specific themes that we've seen in both pop culture and in built work. But I would love to give the opportunity to answer any questions that we have so far, and to start like a broad discussion on the topic of Afrofuturism and landscape architecture. So with that, who has the first question?
Hey, all right. So I do have a couple of questions, but they're more related to you. So how did you find landscape architecture as a fellow Nigerian? What's up? Who family migrated to America? You know, LA is not on our list of desirable options, such as doctors, engineers, quote unquote. So how did you find your way into landscape architecture?
Yeah, good question. I fell into it, and I'm so glad that I tripped, because my dad just retired. He's a college professor, or was a college professor teaching communications. My mom still teaches mathematics collegiate level, math and math education, and for the longest time, I didn't think that I followed in either of their footsteps. People would ask like, oh, do you ever think you're going to go into teaching? And just like knowing what teachers go through, I was like, that is a lot of self-sacrifice. That is a lot of patience. I don't think that I am at that level. But the more time that I spend in the profession, the more I realize that I kind of bridged what both of them do. I like landscape architecture is both art and it is both science. So like the artistic wordsmithing linguistic side of my dad, and then the more measured analytical side of my mom, both come into this. So I thought that I was like deviating from both of what my parents did, but I was in the design program, the environmental design program at NDSU, and our final project of freshman year before we declared a major, or declared a specialty within the design fields. We had a plaza which was close to our campus, and I went to said plaza. We were asked to redesign it, and I was like, well, I don't like, what do you mean redesign the like it exists, so what do you want me to change? So while I was out there, there was somebody who was sitting on one of the cast stone walls, and we got to talking, and I started asking like, oh, well, all right, well, how much are you out here? Oh, a lot. Okay, great. All right, I've got this project. I need to like redesign. Like, what would you want to see out here? And when I was giving my presentation to the class, my professor was like, oh, all right, so you conducted an interview. And he was like, what do you mean we conducted an interview? Oh, all right, yes, I did. It was very intentional, and because of what Jim said. So after like making a mistake that turned out to be right, I was hooked.
That's dope. I love that. That's a story to tell your grandkids for sure. All right, so we got a couple of questions. How do you think white and POC designers can authentically embrace and encourage Afrofuturism in the industry and in public space design? Great question.
Yeah, real good question. And I'm going to break that into a couple pieces, I think. So if I'm understanding correctly, the question was, how do white and POC designers encourage Afrofuturism? And I think that there was a predicate. There was a second half to that question.
Yeah, and authentically embrace and encourage Afrofuturism in the industry and in public space design.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the best way to put the first phrase that popped into my head, and the first phrase is usually not the best way of like getting a message across, but I would say consider not pushing a design similar to my approach on Beltline Trail, where like from asking people what they want, what they need, and then also just trying to feed as much context into the machine as possible so that they can help refine what is truly needed. I in meeting community, client, whoever, where they are, and then allowing them to say, like, history is really important to us, and also something that will last is really important to us. Then also the next generation is really important to us. Like once you have those component pieces, then you've got an understanding that they may not have the vernacular to say, I want Afrofuturism, or I want a contemporary design, or I want something that is avant-garde, or I want XYZ. But at that point, it's your job as the designer who has a, if not a broader and better understanding of what they are asking for, and not better understanding of what they're asking for, but at least the vocabulary that your education and your continuing education has provided you, then I think that you're able to start teasing that out from client, and to hit on the how do non-POC and how do like white designers work in this space. It's two-pronged. Number one, like I've got Black friends that are designers. Like work with them, I hire them. At the same time, like allow your client to also be the designer. Like if you don't have anyone on staff that can represent this authentically, then have the client represent it authentically. Don't try and stretch beyond and put every hat on for the project. Allow the client to take that seat, and you are still a designer and project manager and landscape architect and civil engineer and XYZ, but allow them to be who they need to be for the project. But then also embrace the pipeline, look at HBCUs, look at every and anywhere that POCs are trying to grow, because like in design across the board, not just landscape architecture, but architecture, interior design, all forms of design, the stats of POCs, and it's just very low. And when I say POC, I mean people of color. But the stats are incredibly low. And Stephanie, you hinted at it a little bit of, I've counted 4 Nigerians on this call, I think, and all of us are like, we are all the, we are not the rule. We be like the exclusion from the rule. Because I have 4 siblings, I have 3 siblings. 2 of them are doing just like business. And then one of them continued in the family business and is about to become a college professor. So when I was like, I think I want to design stuff, I was like, design what?
Yes.
But that's a really good question. I appreciate you asking it.
Yeah, definitely. You gotta educate people. Yeah, we have a lot more questions that are great. How do you feel the intersection of Afrofuturism and public health has changed over the last 10 years? Do you feel that the Beltline Trail will improve the folks besides the trail?
So would you read the second half of that question one more time?
Yep. Do you feel that the Beltline Trail will improve the folks besides the trail?
Yeah. So that's a tough question, and I'm glad you asked it, because number one, like the reason for getting into this work is because I do think that work like this will improve like not only connectivity, but then also like human connection. Like it'll make the lives of the people that will use the trail better. I think that it will, well, I'm hopeful, fingers crossed, that it will like extend life expectancy, like marginally, because it's I it's not the only factor in people's lives, but when we're able to invest in active transportation and invest in basically creating blue zones, that's the goal, right? We want to create blue zones for different communities, and in every project that we do, we want that to aid in that work. So I'm hopeful that projects like this will impact health positively. But to speak to the first half of your question, I see that like the vernacular is expanding and it's becoming like more understood across the board. Part of the reason why I am talking about this is because I was influenced by people that use the terminology around me. And then I started looking into it a little bit more. 2 days ago, I just found out, thank you and shout out to Professor Kofi Boone. Hannah Beachler was just writing on the topic of using different words, but essentially equitable placemaking and the work that she had done on Black Panther. And because of that film and because of the wake and the ripple effects from that, like she, a production and set designer, are able to like lend their voice to the conversation of how do we create equitable spaces in the like physical built environment, not just in the movies and the dreamscapes that she's creating, but like what does that look like and how are we able to extrapolate from these fictions to make something real. And like that's the dream. Like that's what Afrofuturism is. Like, oh, we imagined this thing that was purely fictional, purely fake, and now people are asking the question of how do I make a real Wakanda? And I think that answers your first question by saying like we are pushing over the last 10 years, we are seeing a ramp up. Probably not a direct correlation with the line chart that I showed in the beginning, but I do see that increase in not only vernacular, but then also acceptance of these principles. When talking about the Beltline Trail like I went to my barber and I was like, hey, there's this trail that's coming through the neighborhood. And he was like, oh, yeah, I organized this bike ride and I do this and I would use that. And like the trail cuts right next to B&B Gym. Bud Crawford, also from Omaha, boxer, you may have heard of him. And like he's been a big supporter. He's like, oh, well, yeah, this is great. We could like the gym has talked about organizing bike rides and like just having stronger connections with the kids in the area and with the broader community. So like there are those catalyzing and those supportive voices which are all for it. But at the same time, yesterday, we had a conversation with a woman who's been in the area for her entire life, but has had a business in the area for 28 years. And she was incredibly concerned about gentrification coming specifically from trail-oriented development. And like that's just because the focus is on helping the diaspora and helping those that are within this community doesn't exclude or preclude any of the other concerns that as a qualified designer you'd be thinking about, like how do I make sure that I'm creating best final product for not only my client but my client's kid or who are like the next generation. Sustainability doesn't like end at the edge of the water table. Like it expands transdimensionally into like the other facets of our clients and our community's lives. So I am rambling a little bit, but I think that I'm still getting to the meat of what your question is.
Yes, yes. And kind of a related question, comment and question. Kene, thanks so much for your thought-provoking talk. I'm wondering, what roles does material play in creating Afrofuturistic landscapes? Do you see specific materials as part of this typology, or does that depend on the particular community in question?
Yeah, really good question. And I will always say that like within this typology, you have to start big picture and then narrow in. And big picture is I wouldn't look at materiality until I am responding to a specific people. But then at the same time, like, yes, we are, or I would say that there are trends in seeing, well, the trends blur lines a little bit because yes, you're seeing a lot of stone of different types, but then like when you say stone is a material, that's a huge blanket statement because like what type of stone are you talking about? And that's going to be emblematic of the community that you're talking about and the region that you're in. But then when you see metalwork and sublighting and some of the more contemporary elements, that some of that is drawing back to like diasporatic or African themes, but then at the same time, some of that is just like what we envision a future to look like. That's just like contemporary, like temporal placemaking. So in terms of materiality, I would lean on the group or the people to influence all of that because you'll pull so much from whoever you're looking back to. Yeah, that's huge.
All right, two more. We're kind of wrapping up. This one kind of relates back to the Beltline project, but through what vehicles did you attain community input for the Beltline project?
Really good question. We did a few things. So number one, we established our like list of stakeholders. We looked at the alignment. We figured out who are the active parties that are adjacent to this, who are the neighborhood groups, and the organizations that have an active stake in the success of this. And we reached out to them and said, hey, would you actually, we didn't ask, would you be on the stakeholder team? We kind of just said, hi, thank you for being on the stakeholder team. And I'm really grateful for everybody that has been a part of the process and has been answering questions and helping us make this a more thoughtful approach and experience. So that was one part of it. Second, we held public meeting on the front end. So we've held one public meeting and then one open house, which was last night, and then engagement will be ongoing throughout the rest of the project. But public meeting one was held like close to the project area, number one. Number two, we ran it from 4 to 7 p.m. And the reason behind that was just trying to find a time where if you were picking up kids, if you were on your way to grab something after work, if you were, we were trying to catch as many groups as possible and then like leave as much space for people to drop in. So that worked. That worked out all right. That was a pretty good approach, and I think that we'll continue to carry that on. At the same time, we made sure to advertise the event on social media, reaching out to news agencies, specifically looking at POC news agencies and those that are in the community, and then included coloring pages. And each of the coloring pages was like a graphic of like a kid on the trail. Random fact, it is very difficult, or at least it was for me, very difficult to find like coloring pages of Black kids. So that was like an additional bit of time of like making/finding coloring pages where like the people that are like actually using them feel as though they are reflected in the graphic, but all of them were emblematic of like use of the trail or playing adjacent to the trail, placemaking, yada yada. So that was good. They got used a little bit, which I appreciated. We had food and snacks, which is always a win. And then after the physical day of event, we basically converted what we were asking in person onto an online approach so that we could share the survey and have those that weren't able to make it physically report back their thoughts, things that they liked, things that they didn't like. One of the boards that we specifically had was, hey, these are names of people that are in the community. These are names that we've come up with. Here are events that we're thinking of. But what are we wrong about, number one? And then number two, what do you want to see? So about 1/5 of the space was like filled up with different names, ideas, things that we had come up with. And that was great because we got a bunch of names of people from Omaha, in Omaha, that have been doing huge and great things. But at the same time, like one of the names that, I'll admit it, I put it on the board. I was like, oh, well, this seems like a historic name. And the comment was like, excuse you, why in the world would, it's like, okay, that is noted, that will be removed, no need to. But that, I mean, like just trying to make the process as transparent as possible is big. And then with the open house yesterday, like with the individual that came in that was really concerned about like number one, losing her business, number two, the lack of communication with the community, with other projects that had happened before. It just like having a transparent conversation of like, that you're not wrong, like, yeah, like gentrification is real. There's the like your concerns are valid, and like hearing them out, and then also just being transparent, like, all right, here's my card, number one, number two, please give me your contact info so that like we can keep this conversation going. All of those have been good parts of the engagement process. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Yes, you did answer the question. This has been great. I know we're coming up on 7 p.m. right now. And I know we have a couple other questions, but I would recommend you guys to follow Kene on Instagram and Twitter, as I've shared in the chat, where you can ask some more questions and stay connected with him in general. Just want to thank you all for participating tonight. We're happy to have you. As I mentioned earlier, we host this bi-monthly, so our next one will be in September. Make sure to look forward to seeing that, and check out our website, michiganasla.org. Thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, this opportunity.
Yeah. Have a good evening, everyone.